So, when it comes to Christian nationalism and the ideas that Christian nationalism puts forth, that goes back to like the Civil War era, like the late 1880s. During that time, during the Civil War era, there was this idea of what is called the lost cause narrative. And so that was about this alleged Christian civilization that existed prior to the Civil War. And so that was predominantly like whites in the South, white Americans in the South. And so they started blending, churches started to promote these ideas of this Christian civilization that was lost because of the Civil War. And so this idea was also used to justify slavery and this Christian order that was predetermined. And so they would justify this using the Bible, actually. And so during that time, a lot of white supremacist organizations ended up adopting these ideas. And so even the KKK, in their actual like platform, they would say that they were defending a Christian nation. And so this kind of went all the way through the Civil War and the development of these white supremacist organizations. And it was used, as some people in the audience, some of the listeners might have heard before, like things like manifest destiny, the idea that God has determined that this land will be yours. Stuff like that. It's these ideologies that have furthered and justified things like slavery, colonialism, the mass genocide of indigenous people, the destruction of their cultures and beliefs. So it's pretty heavy stuff.
So I'm coming from this discussion. We've stated very obviously that I'm Jewish in the past, and so
Yeah.
I have like no understanding of the Bible, and I'm coming
Mhm.
at this kind of blind. So I don't know if anyone else has this question in the audience, but like one thing I want to know is like, where in the Bible does it say this? Like, where in the Bible does it say that schools can't be integrated? Where in the Bible does it say we shouldn't be busing our kids to different schools? Like, I just don't really understand the connection between like Jesus's words, I
Mhm.
guess, and then the issues that they fight for now.
Yes, so it's not blatant. Definitely, like if you go into the Bible, it's slavery is in the Bible. Like historically that was something that was done in other nations. So it is mentioned in the Bible, but when it comes to justifying these things, what was actually the argument at the time, and if anybody's more interested in reading like in depth about this, there's a book by Anthea Butler, and the title of the book is White Evangelical Racism. And so if you look at, we'll link it below actually. So in that book, she discusses how slavery was actually thought of as punishment for sin from God. So it was not like it was good. they weren't these Christians weren't justifying slavery as if they thought it was a great thing, but it was more like, well, sin was the cause. So now we are living with God's punishment, and this is how things are. This is the social order. And as I'll get into later, like the same argument was used with segregation, upholding segregation, or at least not challenging it in the way like through civil disobedience. They instead would justify as, oh, this is just the social order and we should go through the courts. We should use the what's there, the system that's there, if we do want to challenge that. But really they didn't have like an active movement to oppose that, at least again white evangelicals that adhered to Christian nationalist ideas. So So that's pretty much what was the rationale behind that.
Interesting. Okay.
Yes. So I think and then also that ended up not only this idea of this lost cause narrative and the Christian civilization myth, that wasn't the only thing going on, but also at the same time, this what is called apocalyptic Christianity, this idea of like the end times. So if anybody has heard of like Left Behind, that book series, I think Annie, you said that you read that in your Sunday school or something. Trauma. Yeah, it's a bit traumatic for children to be reading that, but but yeah, so they Left Behind is kind of a product of this apocalyptic Christianity. And again, so the idea of the end times, this apocalypse that's coming, and the Antichrist, and they start watching Christians at the time, and this was like late 1880s. They started watching, like, with urbanization and with technology and like world wars, like throughout history, there will be these peaks where apocalyptic Christianity would come up again, and it was like these threats that they were seeing, and that they were considering like signs of the end times. And so this is pretty powerful when it came to nationalism, because then at the time with World War I, there was this preacher called Billy Sunday, and he was kind of one of the first preachers to openly like endorse nationalism. And so they would further this idea of nationalism to kind of defend this Christian nation in the midst of this future, like, or incoming end times. So there's just a lot going on here.
So your discussion of end times like kind of reminds me of the whole like COVID pandemic. And I was wondering, like, the rights, or like the Christians' right reaction to COVID-19, did they not act towards like saving people or stopping the pandemic because they thought this was like God's movement towards the end times and like movement towards savior through after the end times? Like, is that connected at all?
Well, when it came to COVID-19, there were some that thought it was like a sign that Jesus is coming back. I'm not sure about that, but I do know that lots of churches started when these government regulations, I guess, or restrictions on like mass getting, like groups crowding and all of that, group meetings. When that started, a lot of them started arguing, oh wait, the government is persecuting us. Like, this is the beginning of a totalitarian state for us. Like, we're gonna see a lot of this coming up now. And again, it wasn't about that. It was about preventing people from continuing to spread the virus. And the churches actually were like obviously a big place where you can spread that. So they not only did they oppose that, but they also opposed mask mandates. They opposed vaccines. So a lot of this is rooted in the idea of this threat, this external threat, and that is in part like part of this journey towards the end times. And we saw that with 9/11 too, which is a whole thing when it comes to like the racialization of it all, and what that meant for Muslims and just people of color in general. So yes.
Interesting. Thank you.
All of this also is part of the idea of this spiritual battle. And so a lot of Christians throughout history, and I'll say also, if anybody has heard of Billy Graham and his work as an evangelist and an evangelical leader, he was very focused on saving souls. And part of his thing was actually this idea of, oh, the end is near. Jesus is going to come back soon. So we might as well, instead of focusing on really achieving civil rights, specifically for Black Americans. He didn't really oppose it, but at the time, he was very much playing into this idea of the end times. So let's focus on saving souls, but he also aligned himself with Christian nationalism to an extent because he was very much like anti-communist, like anti-Russia, and defending America as a Christian nation. And at the time, this was called Americanism. So the idea of defending America as the Christian nation against atheist Russia, communist Russia. And so when it comes to segregation and integration, the same thing among evangelicals was seen, where they didn't really, going back to that colorblind idea, they didn't oppose it overtly, although some groups did. But in general, when it comes to Billy Graham and that group of evangelicals, they didn't oppose it overtly, but what they would do is they would just bypass integration. So they would register, when it came to Brown versus Board of Education, they would register their schools, they would create schools for themselves, and they would register them as churches so that they wouldn't get taxed and that they were not held, by the standard of like federal law. And so Bob Jones University was actually a product of this. And this goes even to the 2000s, so hang in there with me. So Bob Jones University, they were registered as a church during integration times, and they actually sued the IRS when obviously that was illegal what they were doing. So they tried to sue the IRS, but that obviously didn't work. So they ended up integrating their schools. But within their policies, they did not allow interracial dating until 2000, the year 2000. And actually, the reason why they changed that rule was because of George W. Bush. He, at the time, visited the Bob Jones University campus. And when people found out, the public, there was some criticism against Bush for that. And so after that, Bob Jones University changed their stance and they apologized for it, but I think we know why they did it.
Yeah, I just want to say that's crazy that they could just call themselves a church to get away from like any responsibility or accountability. And then also that interracial dating was not allowed until 2000, like recently, like in our lifetime. That's insane.
It's also crazy that it took it's also crazy that it took George W. Bush going there for that to make the change. Like the early 2000s were a wild time compared to the world we live in now. It really was a pre-cancel culture canceling via George W. Bush. Who would have thought?
Pretty much.
And it also makes me wonder, like, what else they've been able to get away with through these loopholes. I think that's fascinating. That's just like a rabbit hole you could go down for a long time.
Yeah. Without going down the rabbit hole, I will say, there's been a lot in our like social media right now about BYU. And basically what we're seeing is Christian universities are still doing this, not with interracial dating, but they do it when it comes to like LGBTQ people. You can't be openly, you can't be openly in a relationship or just openly about your identity. So, and that's allowed because it's their faith, it's their beliefs, and you go to their universities, they're private, and you have to uphold those beliefs. And so when we have these conversations, we should think about the fact that this is actually rooted, this is happening now, but it's rooted in history and in going back to integration, which is deeply concerning.